Welcome to the shop, my friend Steve here at SKS Props, and in today's video I have a follow-up to my Hellboy build series, the comic book version of Hellboy Samaritan. Now this particular prop is made out of PVC board, PVC pipe, and of course my HD foam. And I did that because I knew I was going to have a giant barrel on this, and my fear was if all of this was foam that it would be a little too top heavy, a little too wobbly. But by having the PVC in here and then skinning it with my HD foam, the prop turned out great. It has a very good feel to it, but because it's mostly foam, it's still extremely lightweight. Now, if you've been following along to the other props in this series, you can also build your own Samaritan. I, of course, have free PDF files available over on my website that you can download to build right along with me. And building it is one thing, right? But I wanted that iconic comic book look that I achieved on the mask and the right hand of Doom. And for this particular prop, I think I pulled it off. So I want to show you what it takes to put the Samaritan together and paint it. Let's go ahead and get started. For stability, the main body, including the handle, is going to be traced onto some 1/4-inch PVC board. I glued 2 pieces together and then cut these out on the bandsaw. Now if you don't have a bandsaw, you could also use a scroll saw or a jeweler's saw. For the trigger cutout, I start by drilling a pilot hole and then switched over to a Forstner bit to remove more material. This gave me enough room to Dremel out the correct shape. For the bulk of the barrel, I'm going to be using an 1.25" PVC pipe. I'm going to wrap this with 10mm foam, and to figure out how much I'm going to need, I'm going to use a foam ruler. I can then take the template and cut the PVC pipe to fit using a handsaw. I rough up the surface using a sanding sponge, and then I draw a central line for the foam. Now I'm going to heat the foam to make it more malleable, and I make sure to wear my respirator. Weldwood contact cement is going to be applied to both the foam and the pipe. After the contact cement had been allowed to dry, some Bob Smith superglue was applied to the line that I had drawn on the pipe earlier. This double adhesive method makes sure that the foam sticks to the pipe properly. Now if you notice there's a small gap left at the bottom, this is left on purpose. I'm going to insert some foam and cut this flush. This will give me a nice flat area for the bottom of the barrel. To bulk out the body of the Samaritan, I'm going to glue the PVC board to some 2mm foam. Additional material can be cut away, and the process is repeated for the opposite side. Any additional foam will be trimmed away later on. For the grip, I'm going to start by gluing 2 pieces of 10mm foam together. I could then transfer the template onto these pieces and cut it out. That way they're identical. Both of these pieces can now be glued to either side of the body of the Samaritan. Now if you notice here, they're slightly bigger than the body, and that's done purposefully. I can now go back with my Dremel and make everything flush. I do this same process to also clean up the trigger guard. With all these pieces flush, I can now go in with my Dremel and round over the grips, making it more comfortable to hold. After applying a little bit of heat, the grips are good and I can move on to the barrel. I mark on the barrel where the break would be if this were to open. I then follow that line all the way around with a knife, making a gap in the foam, and then I can open that up using a tongue depressor. The barrel can now be attached to the body of the Samaritan, and I do that using some Bob Smith superglue. This lower section will overlap and line up with the break. I'm once again using some 10mm foam. After the strip is cut out, I mark a small section that needs to be removed. Here you can see how it's going to overlap onto the body. I cut out a second piece and then glue those 2 sections together. I then mark and attach this lower frame to the bottom of the barrel. The flaps that are on either side can then also be glued onto the body. To make the connection screw, I'm going to start by cutting some small sections out of 15mm HD foam round dowels. Additional material can be marked and cut away so this part fits flush. To replicate the screw in the center, I use the top of my Dremel sanding drum. Then a chisel point heat tool can be used to finish off this detail. The screw sections can now be glued to either side of the Samaritan. For this bottom detail, I'm going to take my template and transfer that onto a strip of 10mm foam. This piece is marked, cut out, and then glued into place. I cut a shallow line in the body of the Samaritan to simulate that the break went all the way down, and to help refine the gap I used some foam clay. For the hammer on the back, I transferred that template onto some 1/4-inch PVC board. I sanded the bottom of the piece to get the curve correct, and then I was able to glue that into place. The same process was also used for the trigger. With the hammer and the trigger now connected, I could start working on the details for the top of the Samaritan. To craft this small piece, I'm going to be using a small section of 10mm HD foam round dowel. I used my Dremel to create a channel and a small hole punch to create a detail on the side. And then this section could be glued into place. The small detail on the top was transferred onto some 10mm foam. It was cut out and then glued down. This even smaller detail on the very top was cut out of some scrap foam and then glued into place. The front sight was cut out of some 10mm foam, and I glued a small piece of 2mm foam underneath just as an added detail. The big thing to watch here is just to make sure that it lines up with the middle of the barrel. For the back section, I traced around the barrel onto some 10mm foam and cut that out. A Dremel was used to round these sections over, and after a quick heat treatment, these pieces can be glued to either side. A small rivet detail was added with a hole punch. For the opposite side, the release mechanism was transferred onto some 2mm foam. This piece was cut out, and then for the texture I did the score and heat technique, which allowed these gaps to open up. The end of a pin can then be pressed into the foam to simulate a rivet. For the handle details, I took my template and marked on either side, then connected these lines. Now I wanted these to look pretty worn, so I used the chisel bit on my heat tool to score the foam. I also used a pin file to clean up some of the singed foam. For the ring on the bottom of the Samaritan, I cut off a small section of some PVC pipe. After this piece had been sanded, I then took some HD foam half-round dowel and wrapped it around the top of the ring. I think this did a pretty decent job creating a small clasp. I drilled into the bottom of the handle with a 1/4-inch Forstner bit and then glued the ring into place. I wanted to clean up some of my gaps, so I used some quick seal. Now you don't have to do this, it just helps make the build look a little bit cleaner. I apply the quick seal with a silicone tip tool, and I wipe away any additional with some water. I had a few battle damages here and there, and the Samaritan is ready for paint. 2 light coats of Plasti Dip are used to seal the prop, and for my base color I used some Krylon Primer Ultra Flat Gray. To paint the main body of the gun, I'm going to be using Utrecht brand Titanium White and Liquitex Mars Black. These pigments are mixed together and then painted all over the prop using a filbert brush. For the grips on the gun, I'm going to be using Liquitex Heavy Body Burnt Umber. With this paint, I'm not adding a lot of water, so it covers pretty well. Just like the comic book, I'm looking for solid colors that don't have a lot of variation. For the highlights on the gun, I'm going to start by using some painter's tape on the sides. More titanium white was added to my gray mixture, and that was painted onto the barrel. I would recommend not to add any water to this mixture because it'll have a tendency to run underneath of the tape. Using a liner brush, I also add highlights to various parts of the gun, including the screw ports and the trigger guard. There's no right or wrong way to do this, so just look at your prop and see where you think highlights might look best. Just like my Hellboy mask and my right hand of doom, I'm going to be adding some Liquitex Mars Black. These will represent the shadows that are ever present in the comic book. If you do have areas where it bleeds under the tape a little bit while it's still wet, you can use a brush to wipe it off. This same shadow process was also applied to the grips. After the battle damage in the front of the barrel had been painted, I took a step back, and I'm really happy with this overall effect. For the rope attached to the ring, I decided to keep that comic book look. I wanted to braid some 2mm foam. Then, just like the Samaritan, I primed this foam with some Plasti-Dip and I sprayed it with some yellow primer. The rope was then tied around the ring and it could be glued into place. Then, to match the aesthetic of the rest of the pistol, I took my liner brush and outlined some of these segments.
So you all can see the steps that I took to put together my own comic book version of the Samaritan. And again, I have free PDF files available over my website. Download those, build right along with me. And if you're building any of my builds or using some HD foam, be sure to tag me at SKS Props on Twitter and Instagram because I want to see your creations. Until next time, build your best with the best. HD foam.